back in that bag again. Whoa, whoa.
Okay, so today we're going super deep on something I think a lot of you have been asking about, and sending in some really great material on the story of Nokia.
Oh, yeah.
And it really is, I mean, talk about a roller coaster, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, incredible rise and then just a dramatic, fall from grace.
That's a classic.
And what we really want to do is sort of extract the key lessons here, right?
Yeah.
So not get too bogged down in, all the super technical stuff, but just sort of like, what are the big aha moments?
Yeah, the big takeaways from all this.
Yeah, what can we learn from Nokia?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's really fascinating from the get-go, even before we get into the mobile phone side of things, is just how Nokia evolved over time. I mean, this is a company that's been around since 1865.
Wow.
Starting as a paper mill in Finland.
I had no idea.
Right. So, not exactly a tech company from the beginning.
Right.
It wasn't until the 1980s that they really make that big jump into telecommunications. Focusing first on building mobile networks.
Yeah.
And then eventually, the actual mobile phones themselves.
Right.
And they were really pioneers in GSM technology.
Right. So that's like the early digital, mobile communication standard that kind of like became the global thing.
Exactly. Yeah. They were right there at the forefront of that.
That's wild to think about. I mean, paper to like that. I mean,
it's a huge leap.
It's a huge leap. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what makes their peak all the more fascinating.
Right.
In the late 90s, early 2000s.
I mean, they were the mobile phone.
They were the mobile phone.
Yeah.
They're the biggest manufacturer in the world by the late 90s.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the way they achieved that dominance.
Yeah. How did they do it?
Well, a lot of the material talks about their focus on durable, user-friendly feature phones.
Right. Like the old...
Yeah, the Nokia 3310.
The indestructible...
Indestructible phone. The Nokia 1100.
Yeah.
These were phones that weren't necessarily packed with features.
Right.
But they were incredibly reliable.
They just worked.
It just worked.
Yeah.
Easy to use, and they were built to last.
Right.
And they were very affordable.
Right.
Especially in emerging markets.
Right.
And that was a key part of their strategy.
Okay.
They understood that in those markets, people needed a phone that was reliable and affordable.
Right.
And that's what they delivered.
Right. So kind of meeting that real need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they had a strong commitment to research and development as well.
Oh, yeah.
Which allowed them to stay ahead of the curve for a time.
And they also had that Symbian operating system.
Oh, yeah. Symbian?
Which I remember using those phones.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, that was...
For its time, it was pretty advanced.
It was advanced, yeah. And we're talking, early mobile gaming,
Snake, yeah.
Snakes.
Yeah.
Basic internet connectivity.
Yeah.
Even camera phones.
Camera phones.
Way before the iPhone.
Yeah, they were really ahead of the curve with some of that stuff.
So they had that, almost 50% global market share in 2007.
It's hard to believe how quickly that changed.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing that's just crazy to me. Like, how do you go from that to essentially, where they are today?
It's a great question.
And the sources kind of pinpoint, 2007, 2008.
Yeah.
iPhone comes out.
Right.
Android comes out.
Yeah, that's the turning point.
And what was it about those, those new, devices that really kind of changed the game?
Well, I think the biggest thing was the shift to touchscreen smartphones.
Okay.
Before that, Nokia was all about physical keypads.
Right.
The classic Nokia design.
Yeah.
But Apple and Google, they came out with these sleek touchscreen devices.
Right.
Full web browsing.
Right.
App stores with tons of apps.
Right.
It was a completely different experience.
Totally different, yeah.
And it seems like Nokia just didn't really see it coming.
They didn't get it.
They didn't get it. They were still focused on making better feature phones.
Right.
With better hardware.
Right.
But the software and the user experience, that's what people really started to care about.
Yeah, it wanted the whole package.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where I think Nokia's software strategy really let them down.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit, because the sources really kind of highlight that as like a major, kind of Achilles heel.
Yeah. Their reliance on Symbian, which had been an advantage early on.
Right.
It really started to hold them back.
Okay.
Because Symbian was a closed system.
Okay.
It was really difficult for developers to make apps for it.
Gotcha.
So the app selection was very limited.
Right.
Compared to, Android, which was open source.
Right.
And had this huge, thriving app ecosystem.
Right. Tons of developers jumping in.
Exactly. And the sources also talk about Nokia's attempt with MeeGo.
Yeah.
Which had some potential,
Okay.
but it just came way too late.
Too little, too late.
Too little, too late. They
Yeah.
couldn't catch up.
And then there was the whole Microsoft partnership.
Oh, yeah, the big Microsoft gamble?
Yeah, they decided to go with Windows Phone OS.
In 2011.
Yeah.
On paper, it seemed like a good idea.
Right, these two giants coming together
Right.
to take on, Apple and Google.
Right.
But
it didn't really work out that way.
it didn't really work.
No.
Why not?
Well, the sources talk about a few key problems.
Okay.
Windows Phone just didn't have the same app ecosystem as iOS or Android.
Okay.
So there weren't as many apps available.
Gotcha.
And developers weren't really interested in making apps for it.
Okay.
It also had a reputation for being slow
Okay.
and not getting updates as quickly as the other platforms.
So it just kind of felt clunky and behind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while all this was happening, Samsung and Apple, they were just racing ahead.
Innovating like crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nokia and Microsoft, they just couldn't keep up.
So it sounds like it wasn't just about the competition, though, right? The sources also talk about some internal factors that contributed to Nokia's decline.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were definitely some internal issues that played a role.
Like what?
Well, the sources talk about the slow reaction of Nokia's leadership to the changes in the market.
Okay, so they weren't adapting fast enough.
Exactly. They were too focused on hardware.
Okay.
They were still trying to make the best phones in terms of build quality and features,
Right.
but they weren't paying enough attention to the software and the user experience,
Right.
which is what people really cared about.
Right.
And there were also issues with their corporate culture.
Okay.
It was very bureaucratic.
Okay.
Decisions were made very slowly.
Right.
And it was just difficult for them to be agile and respond quickly to the changes that were happening.
And the sources also talk about, some specific examples of this, right? I think there was some discussion about them, initially dismissing touchscreen technology.
Yeah, there were some leaders at Nokia who thought that touchscreens were just a fad. Yeah, they didn't think it was going to catch on.
Wow.
And that obviously turned out to be a huge mistake.
Huge.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because a lot of the sources kind of talk about this idea of, Nokia being a victim of its own success.
Okay.
They were so successful for so long
With the feature phones, yeah.
with the feature phones that they just couldn't adapt when the market changed.
Right, they got stuck in their ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can see that in their market share. It just completely plummeted.
I mean, from almost 50% in 2007
Yeah.
to below 5% just a few years later.
It's incredible how quickly it happened.
That's insane.
Yeah, and it really shows you how competitive the tech industry is.
Right.
If you don't adapt, you die.
Adapt or die, yeah.
And then, of course, in 2014, Microsoft acquired Nokia's mobile phone division.
For $7.2 billion.
Which, at the time seemed like maybe a lifeline for Nokia.
Right.
But ultimately, the Windows Phone strategy just didn't work out.
Right. And Microsoft ended up shutting down Nokia's phone business.
Yeah, it was a sad end to an era.
It really is.
But, I think there are some really valuable lessons we can learn from Nokia's story.
Okay, so let's talk about those lessons.
Right.
What are the big aha moments here?
Well, I think the first one is the importance of adaptability.
Okay.
Nokia's failure to adapt to the smartphone revolution is a cautionary tale.
Right.
It shows that no matter how successful you are, you can't afford to be complacent.
Right. You always have to be looking ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second lesson is the importance of software and ecosystem.
Okay.
Nokia was so focused on hardware,
Right.
but they neglected the software side of things.
Right.
And that's ultimately what killed them.
Right. They didn't have the apps. They didn't have the developer support.
Exactly. They didn't have the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Apple and Android, they understood that the software was just as important as the hardware.
Right. It was about the whole experience.
Exactly. And the third lesson is the importance of innovation.
Okay.
Nokia was a very innovative company early on,
Right.
but they kind of lost their way.
Okay.
They stopped innovating in key areas like touchscreens and app stores.
Right.
And that allowed their competitors to leapfrog them.
Right.
And the final lesson is the importance of leadership.
Okay.
Nokia's leadership was slow to react to the changes in the market,
Right.
and they made some poor decisions.
Okay.
And that ultimately contributed to their downfall.
Yeah. So it's really kind of a combination of all those factors, right?
Exactly. It's a complex story,
Yeah.
but I think there's some really clear lessons we can take away from it.
And it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the sources do talk about, kind of a second chapter for Nokia.
Yeah, definitely.
So what happened there?
Well, in 2016, the Nokia brand was revived by HMD Global.
Okay.
which is a Finnish company.
Okay.
And they started making Android smartphones.
Okay, so they finally embraced Android.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was a smart move.
Right, because now they have access to that huge app ecosystem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Nokia is also focusing more on 5G technology and network infrastructure these days,
Okay.
which are areas where they have a lot of expertise.
Right, so they're kind of going back to their roots in a way.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
So they're not the same company they were in the early 2000s,
Right.
but they're still a major player in the telecommunications industry,
Right.
and they're still innovating.
So it's a comeback story in a way.
Yeah, I think so.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's good to see.
Yeah. So to wrap up our deep dive into Nokia,
Yeah.
the key takeaways are really about, adapting quickly to change.
Absolutely.
Understanding the importance of software and ecosystem continuously innovating and having strong leadership.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay. And I think, the big question that we should all be asking ourselves now is what other seemingly, dominant industries or technologies out there might be vulnerable to this kind of disruption?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, what can we learn from Nokia's story?
Yeah.
To avoid, making the same mistakes?
Yeah, because it can happen to anyone.
It can happen to anyone.
Even the giants can fall.
Yeah.
If they're not careful.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important lesson for all of us to remember.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.